So we'll hear from Dr. Gordon. Thank you, Dr. Elderi. We'll hear from Dr. Gordon about no. No.
Thank you. I don't think you started with my first slide that has my disclosures, but I don't have any disclosures for this talk. And I will say that is OCT useful for diagnosis? There's a qualified no. And I have an uphill battle because obviously the pretest showed that, the tide is against me. So let's see. Okay, great. So we know that Drusen are not uncommon. All of you see them. You're pediatric ophthalmologists or comprehensive ophthalmologists. But the real question here is, on that first time that you see that patient, not on serial testing, does that patient have papilledema, or does that patient have Drusen, or does that patient have both? And it's even more important in children to try to make the right decision and diagnosis. So the question for me is, what's the best method that distinguishes or identifies papilledema in children? So we saw ultrasound. Well, it's great if there's calcification, but often there's not in children, so it doesn't necessarily help you if it's negative. OCT. Well, the original OCT is not very sensitive. The enhanced depth imaging, much more sensitive. So we do see buried drusen with EDI OCT. Fluorescein angiography, not always great in small children, but this was a 12-year-old. Papilledema shows early and late leakage. It is the gold standard. Drusen shows no late leakage, but you can have some staining. That can mess you up some of the time. Fundus autofluorescence, again, can be helpful, but the sensitivity is better if they're large or superficial lesions. And then OCT angiography, which we have not heard the end of yet. So we heard already about the Optic Drusen Studies Consortium. Lucky for me that this was published last year. But what are the rules about this, and how is this going to be helpful for every one of you in everyday practice, not necessarily doing studies of this disease, but you're confronted with the patient and their family. So what are the rules? Well, we ignore these peripapillary hyperreflective mass-like structures because they're not specific for Drusen. We can see them, but we can see them in other diseases as well. Well, what are the other rules? What do Drusen look like? Well, they look like the absence of space here. They're those red asterisks. And sometimes you can see them with the hyperreflective margin, which I'll show you. They're above the lamina cribosa. They have a low signal core. They're empty spaces on this EDI. You can see that hyperreflective margin up above, and they can be found in groups with internal reflectivity. So there can be a variability to how they look. So when we look at the consortium recommendations for diagnosis of optic disc drusen, it tells you that OCT technology is changing. So as it changes, it's getting better, but you can still have some interference or noise from superficial drusen. And most importantly, a negative result, or one in which you don't see drusen, doesn't help you. You can still have drusen. You could still have papilledema, and that's really the question here. There are case reports in the literature of children with both papilledema and optic disc drusen. You don't want to be the one that says this child has drusen when they have drusen and papilledema. So you can start with the EDI OCT and say, are there drusen here? If it's no, then obviously you need to look further. What about if it's yes? Well, if it's yes, you still need to ask about symptoms and signs of increased intracranial pressure. You really need to rule out papilledema. So how do we best distinguish drusen from true disc edema in children? It can be challenging to differentiate buried drusen from true disc edema. B scans are accurate in about half of the cases. Fundus autofluorescence can identify some of them that are identified by B-scan, but there's variability depending upon which studies you look at. Fluorescein angiography, and I might say that our two organizers of this session have written extensively on this topic. I'm not sure why they're not arguing this point, but fluorescein is great for looking at true papilledema, has limited use in very young children, but the bottom line, OCT will not exclude disc edema. It will not exclude disc edema. So what's the best approach? Probably combinatorial. It's okay to use the EDI OCT, but you need to make sure they don't have papilledema. Thank you.